Welcome to Mint. I'm Vidya Krishnan. In today's episode of From the Newsroom, we are joined by Malia Politzer. Welcome, Malia.
Thanks, Vidya.
We will be discussing the Supreme Court's directive issued earlier this week to Health Ministry and state governments, asking them to furnish data regarding clinical trials conducted across the country in India. This is happening after consistent reports of irregularities in clinical trials conducted by multinational pharmaceutical companies in India. So, Malia, can you please tell us what are the allegations petitioners have made in the Supreme Court?
So this PIL, Vidya, is actually quite old. It was filed in February 2012 by a public health advocacy group based out of Madhya Pradesh. And essentially they're drawing attention to about 90 clinical trials that were conducted at primarily government hospitals and MP that affected 3,300 trial participants. And among those, there were 233 mentally ill patients, as well as pregnant women and about 1,800 children. So the allegations are fairly serious. They have said that these patients didn't have proper consent, so they didn't actually know they were participating for the most part in clinical trials at all. They're also alleging that doctors were paid, I think, 5.5 crore rupees by multinational companies to conduct these clinical trials, and that the patients' health was not taken into account. So a lot of these patients didn't have health insurance, and in the case of adverse effects, they weren't attended to properly. There were also 81 deaths that were associated with these clinical trials, and many of them weren't actually compensated, and families weren't compensated. So this is the nature of the allegations that are being, that are a part of the PIL. Now, I know you've also been following this case, Vidya. Can you tell me a little bit about the government response?
The government has largely remained unresponsive as these events have unfolded. Clinical trial irregularities are not just peculiar to Madhya Pradesh. They've been happening across the country. There have been reports that in Guntur, men were tested for breast cancer drug. In Khammam district in Andhra Pradesh, tribal girls were a part of an HPV vaccine trial without any informed consent. In the case of Madhya Pradesh, it came to national attention because high-profile victims, survivors of Bhopal gas tragedy, were enrolled in clinical trials, and in the case of Indore, there was tangible paper trail basis which the state government could take action against these doctors. So that kind of set the ball rolling, but the state government initiated two inquiries. One was by the Economic Offences Wing, which conclusively proved the conflict of interest between the doctors who were conducting the trials, those who were on ethics committees, and the pharmaceutical companies which were paying these doctors. Then there was a joint director in the state government in Madhya Pradesh who submitted a report in June last year recommending that criminal proceedings should be initiated against all these doctors, and the government should serve them with a lifetime ban. Only none of that has happened. In the meanwhile, the petitioners and clinical trial victims have got together, and Madhya Pradesh is the only place where you have a clinical trial victims association. And they petitioned the Supreme Court for some action because human rights commissions in state and national level have yet not yielded any results. So because none of the complaints were getting any answers, the petitioners moved to court. And in the meanwhile, companies have consistently played down the issue. You've been tracking the companies, so could you please tell us how the companies are reacting to this growing disapproval of clinical trials in the country?
So the companies have basically three generic responses to allegations around clinical trials, and these have been quite consistent. The first one is that only 2% of all clinical trials in the world are done in India, and that actually India would like to have should have more clinical trials, because historically clinical trials are done on people who are genetically different from Indians, Caucasians primarily, and so a lot of these drugs aren't necessarily as effective on Indians as they otherwise would be. So having more clinical trials in India is actually a good thing. The second main point is essentially that only 20% of Indians are insured, and 35% are below the poverty line. So this is actually a source of health coverage for people that otherwise wouldn't have it. And the final point that they make is that these cases, while very high profile, are not representative of the industry at large and tarnish the image of an industry that's actually doing a lot of good for the country. So those are the main points. Now, Vidya, can you tell us what you would expect to see from the government and the parliament in the upcoming months?
Well, the first thing that everyone, civil society organizations are expecting is that we will have coherent data, credible government data on clinical trial industry in public domain for the first time, basis which regulatory framework can be provided. The second is a parliamentary panel investigation that is currently underway. Civil society organizations expect it within the next 3 months. This is the same panel which had in May this year established that the drug controller of the country was in collusion with pharmaceutical companies and giving marketing licenses for drugs to be sold in India without good evidence. Now, since clinical trial is a huge, significant sector, they decided to tackle that in a separate report. Now, that is once that comes out, we will have a very good idea of where we are erring, where the issue of governance is lacking, and hopefully with court's intervention, we can see government taking some tangible steps to address the issues raised by complainants, victims, and petitioners. So,
yeah, so hopefully we'll actually see some meaningful regulatory framework in the upcoming months.
Yes, certainly. On that note, we will be ending this show. Thank you for joining us, Malia.
Thank you for having me, Vidya.
Thank you for watching. Stay tuned.